All right. I don't think everyone has been here before, right? So I'm not going to bother to Okay, my name is Jeremy Dowsett, and I am qualified to give these lectures because I am most of the way finished with a PhD in Catholic theology, specializing in Catholic social teaching. So this, if you have not been here before, this is lecture 4 in a series of 10. So we kind of laid the groundwork talking about the basic philosophical assumptions of the culture that we live in America, in the modern West. And then we worked our way through the basic principles of Catholic social teaching, which are the ones on the bottom of this pyramid here, which you just had a chance to acquire a copy of and did not avail yourself of if you didn't take it. And tonight, I'm going to talk about this guy right here on the pyramid, family as the first society. So tonight I'm going to address the church's teachings around sexuality and marriage and try to demonstrate for anyone who might be unconvinced that these teachings are not simply moral teachings in the individualistic sense of do's and don'ts around one's personal sexual conduct, but they are in fact teachings that address societal issues. They are a part of the church's social teaching. So in the world of academic theology, things are, like in many parts of society now, pretty polarized. And the left side of that divide in academic theology tends to be pretty enthusiastic about Catholic social teaching. They tend to claim Catholic social teaching as their own. But if you ask those folks what Catholic social teaching means to them, it's only the economic parts of Catholic social teaching. It's the preferential option for the poor, and the defense of labor unions, and the critique of unfettered capitalism, and the protection of the environment. Now, all of those things are, in fact, a part of the church's social teaching, and because of that, I am all for them. However, I find it rather troubling that these same people will openly dissent from the church's teaching on abortion, contraception, homosexuality, gender theory, etc. These same folks will just say that the church is just wrong about all these issues and needs to update her teaching in order to conform with modern scientific knowledge or whatever. And so if you look at a lot of books, not all of them, but a lot of books on Catholic social teaching, they're just sort of silent about marriage, family, and sexuality, which can give the impression that these are unrelated to the economic and political issues in Catholic social teaching. Okay, so it is easy enough to charge these folks with being cafeteria Catholics, right? To say they're guilty of claiming the authority of the church only when it suits them. But arguments from authority don't really land with people in our anti-authoritarian culture. And so I want to make a different kind of case tonight, and that is the case that the church's teaching around social and economic justice and the church's teaching around sexuality are integral parts of one coherent vision of a just and flourishing society. And it is only when we are submerged in the waters of liberalism, capital L liberalism, in the ideologies of the left and right that they appear to be two unrelated sets of doctrine. In other words, I will try to make the case that if you care about the social justice stuff, if you care about the poor and working class, if you care about the rights and flourishing of women, if you are concerned about the detriment of the logic of the market creeping into our lives, And if you care about the environment, then you should embrace rather than reject the church's teaching on sexuality and marriage. Does that make sense? So I'll start by laying out the church's sort of positive vision of marriage and family, and then I will basically just list all of the moral judgments that the church has made in order to protect that positive vision of marriage and family. And then I will try to connect the dots between two of those moral judgments and social justice issues, like the concern for the poor or the rights of women and the environment. It's cold today. So if you look at the table of contents of the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, which again is sort of like the catechism of the church's social teaching, and it is itself a magisterial document issued under Pope John Paul II. If you look at the structure of the compendium, the first chapter lays out the fundamental principles of Catholic social teaching, which we did here over the last 2 lectures. And then the second chapter, immediately following, addresses family and marriage. So before it addresses labor, economics, politics, war, or the environment, it addresses family and marriage. Likewise, if you look at Gaudium et Spes, which is one of the constitutions from Vatican II, its English title is usually given as the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. Its second half is just a summary of Catholic social teaching, and it begins with a chapter on marriage and the family before proceeding to economic, social, and political questions. Why? Because the family is the fundamental building block of society. Or as the compendium puts it, it is the first society and the vital cell of larger societies. So again, if you had the pyramid chart, you can see family as first society is one of the principles on there. So what does it mean that the family is the first society? Well, if you were here for the explanation of the principle of subsidiarity, you remember that societies, human communities of various scales are always interacting with one another. So the family is the smallest scale society on the ladder of subsidiarity that we talked about. And in that sense, it is the first society, which means it takes priority over every other society, including the state, as the community that is responsible for its members first. And again, if we think about that ladder, in some sense, the larger societies, as we move up the ladder, are made up of the smaller societies. And so the compendium says, without families that are strong in their communion and stable in their commitment, peoples, that is, national societies, will grow weak and fail to function properly. In other words, if families are the bricks, then neighborhoods, churches, schools, cities, and countries are the buildings built from those bricks. Now, you could have a master bricklayer build a house and do it perfectly, but if the individual bricks crumble, the house will crumble. So why is the family the brick in this analogy? Because it is in the family that each human person receives the fundamental formation, their fundamental formation, as a human person. So it is chronologically the first society for each of us, because it is in the family first that each of us learns about truth and goodness. Each of us learns what it means to love and be loved, and how people with different gifts and capacities form a community where all are cared for and all contribute. The family is where we become aware of our own dignity and the dignity of others, where we begin to develop our potential and prepare for our unique vocation. The family is also uniquely suited to hand on the cultural heritage of a people and the spiritual and religious values needed to become an ethical adult member of that people. The family then has a special function that cannot be replaced by any other society. It raises up each new person and prepares him or her to be integrated into the larger societies on the ladder. Another way to say this is, the family is the first place where we all learn the truth of the principles of human dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity, and the common good. Not that children would be able to articulate those things. But the role family plays as the vital cell of society extends beyond our childhood. For even after we enter adulthood, our parents and siblings continue to be the first and most loyal support system we have for most of us. When we encounter the ordinary challenges and hardships of life, the birth of a child, the loss of a spouse, an unexpected change in jobs, for most people, most of the time, our family is who supports us. And the fact that these ties endure throughout our life means that extended families, aunts, uncles, cousins, are also part of the social fabric that holds a community together. Notice then that the church defines the health of a family according to the strength of its communion and the stability of its commitment. In order to experience the family as the climate of natural affection, where they can grow into their full potential and be socialized and integrated into society, children need a family founded on the permanent commitment of the two people who created them. The social scientific data that shows better life outcomes for kids in married households is so overwhelming that I'm not going to rehearse it here. But the point is that the health and strength of a society is dependent on the health and strength of families. And the health and strength of a family is dependent on the marriage at its foundation. This fact, that the good of children is also the common good of a local community and a national society, should begin to give us a sense that marriage must have certain features in order to facilitate those goods. In other words, it cannot be a completely subjective human invention, but must have some objective definition. And its objective definition can be discerned from the fact that each and every human person is generated by the union of one man and one woman and needs the lifelong nurture and care of that man and that woman. Marriage must, by definition then, be ordered to the procreation and education of children, which is, of course, exactly what the church teaches. To be clear, the church teaches that marriage is not solely for procreation, which is one of the misunderstandings about the Catholic Church's teachings about marriage. It is also for the good of the spouses in their interpersonal relationship. The church calls this the unitive purpose of marriage. And it is for the other kinds of fruitfulness besides children that will overflow from the love of the spouses out to others. The farmer and writer Wendell Berry, who is not Catholic, expresses well this positive vision for marriage in a way that draws out that it is precisely in its being ordered to procreation that marriage forms the foundation of just societies. This is a long quote, but it's worth reading. Sexual love is the heart of community life. Sexual love is the force that in our bodily life connects us most intimately to the creation, to the fertility of the earth, to farming and the care of animals. It brings us into the dance that holds the community together and joins it to its place. This is why a sexual ethic of community life is centered on marriage. Lovers must not live for themselves alone. They must finally turn from their gaze at one another back toward the community. If they had only themselves to consider, lovers would not need to marry, but they must think of others and of other things. So they say their vows to the community as much as to one another, and the community gathers around them when they marry because it understands how necessary and how fearful this joining is. Marriage, this joining of the two, brings them in the same breath into the freedom of sexual consent and into the fullest earthly realization of the image of God. From their joining, other living souls come into being, and with these other living souls, great responsibilities that are fearful, joyful, and unending. The marriage of the two lovers joins them to one another, to forebears, to descendants, to the community, to heaven, and to earth. It is the fundamental connection without which nothing holds. It is the fundamental connection without which nothing holds. It is the fundamental connection without which nothing holds. That is what it means that the family is the first society and that marriage is its foundation. If the family is to be everything that Barry so beautifully describes, our connection to the fertility of the earth, to the community we live in, to our forebears and our descendants, if families are to be the solid bricks with which we can build just and flourishing societies, if they are to be stable communities of love in which children can reach their full potential, then marriage, as the fundamental connection at the heart of it all, must have certain features. Marriage must be total, permanent, faithful, and fruitful. Total means the spouses give themselves to each other in every aspect of their person. The totality of this mutual self-giving also entails permanence, faithfulness, and fruitfulness. A total gift must also be permanent. A gift that is taken back is not a gift. This means the bond formed between spouses is indissoluble, which means indestructible. It cannot be broken or undone by anything but death. A total gift is also faithful. You cannot give yourself totally to someone while you are also giving yourself to another. And a total gift is fruitful. You cannot withhold from your spouse your reproductive cells and still call your gift a total gift. This is, of course, exactly what the church teaches are the defining features of marriage. But I want to pause here and make the point that I have argued for this definition of marriage based on reason. I have not had to claim the authority of the church or the magisterium or scripture here. This is what the church teaches about marriage, but it is not a religious belief that is true for Catholics, but not true for others. It is just true. It is inscribed in the very structure of the human person. So in the same way that when the church teaches that all people have equal dignity, which is something that is obvious to most people now, but has not been obvious for most of human history, she is not teaching something that is just true for Catholics. She is naming a reality about the human person. All people have equal dignity. That is just true. In the same way, when the church teaches that a marriage is a total, permanent, faithful, and fruitful union between two people, she is naming a reality about human nature. So, once we see what marriage is objectively, that it is by its nature ordered to the procreation and rearing of children, that it is uniquely suited to form human beings to understand how to love and live in community with others, that it is the connective tissue that holds extended family networks and neighborhoods together, and the primary place a people's culture and values are handed on to the next generation. In other words, once we see that it is the fundamental connection without which nothing in a society holds, then we can see that the church's sexual ethic is not some arbitrary or outdated list of prohibitions, much less is it oppressive or hateful. The church says no to all the things she says no to because they violate this fundamental connection without which nothing holds. And in so doing, they violate the human rights of children, of women, and of men, and they do violence to the common good by attacking the first and vital cell of society. This is why the church says no to divorce, abortion, homosexual acts, same-sex marriage, transgenderism, contraception, surrogacy, and IVF, precisely because she is protecting the human rights of children, of women, of men, and because she is protecting all of those connections necessary for a just and flourishing society that will not hold if that fundamental connection, marriage, does not hold. Now, I cannot, in the span of this lecture, demonstrate how each of these prohibitions is a defense of social justice and the common good. So I will take the two that are probably the hardest for most people, or at least in our current cultural moment, perhaps the hardest for people to talk about, even if they already agree with what the church teaches. So, let's start with same-sex marriage. Some of you may be thinking, or some of you may be thinking about someone who might be thinking, Jeremy, the positive vision of marriage that you've laid out is beautiful and it's all fine and good in an ideal world, but the world is not ideal, and most families are full of all kinds of brokenness, and so we have to adapt, we have to work with what we've got. And so, can't the church, as a kind of pastoral concession, open marriage to same-sex couples? No, we cannot. And this again is because marriage is an objective reality. It is not a human convention that can be altered to adapt to cultural changes in morals. Its features were established with the creation, by the Creator, with the creation of the human person. And its features are discernible whether you believe in that Creator or not. And one of those objective features is that marriage is fruitful. That is, that it is open to the generation of new life. Fruitfulness is objectively impossible for same-sex couples. Therefore, it is not within the church's power to open marriage to same-sex couples. Here's an analogy. If tomorrow, Isaac, imagine if tomorrow, half the population started complaining that it was an oppressive and arbitrary restriction of their freedom that sunrise can only happen in the morning. And they petitioned the National Weather Service to lift the ban on evening sunrises and change the definition of sunrise to allow the sun to rise in the evening too. The National Weather Service could do that, but it would not make sunsets into sunrises. It would just result in a lot of people mistakenly referring to sunsets as sunrises and create a lot of confusion for people trying to meet at sunrise for a run. The same would be true if the church were to lift the ban on same-sex marriage in the church, or change the definition of marriage to include same-sex couples. That would not change same-sex relationships into marriages. It would just result in a lot of people mistakenly referring to same-sex relationships as marriages and generate a lot of confusion. So, you might say, okay, I can see why we have this view of marriage as Catholics, but we live in a pluralistic society where our view of marriage has to peacefully coexist alongside other views of marriage. So politically, we should be in favor of gay marriage, right? It is easy to think this because our popular culture has done an excellent job of gaslighting Christians into thinking that we must be bigoted or intolerant or stupid because the pro-gay marriage position harms nobody, but the pro-traditional marriage view harms gay people. So there's no rational reason to oppose gay marriage. I remember a line from a movie. I could not find what the movie was because I can't remember anything else about it except this one line. But I remember very clearly this one line where a character who is like the stereotypical uptight, judgmental Christian, similar to Angela from The Office, if you're familiar with The Office, is arguing with another character in the movie and says, "You know what happens when you let gay people get married, don't you? It ruins marriage for everyone." And I thought, that joke right there crystallizes in a single sentence how they are gaslighting us. Because the joke, of course, is that any decent, rational person can see that changing the definition of marriage to include same-sex couples in no way impacts straight marriages. It simply extends a right that had previously been enjoyed by a limited group to everyone. And only a bigot would oppose that. When in fact, this character that was being held up for mockery and derision in this movie that I cannot remember was actually exactly right. The compendium puts it this way: if, from a legal standpoint, marriage between a man and a woman were to be considered just one possible form of marriage, the concept of marriage would undergo radical transformation with grave detriment to the common good. By putting homosexual unions on a legal plane analogous to that of marriage and family, the state acts arbitrarily and contradicts its duties. In other words, when you redefine marriage to include same-sex couples, all marriages become gay marriages, in the sense that, from a legal and cultural standpoint, all marriages are reduced to simply a sexual partnership of indeterminate length. This blinds us as a culture to the fundamental features of marriage, without which nothing else holds: its totality, its permanence, its faithfulness, and its fruitfulness. So redefining marriage does not extend a right that had been enjoyed by some people to everyone. It just confuses large portions of society about what marriage actually is. And in doing so, it erodes the social support that actual marriages need to thrive. The redefinition of marriage was not the first thing to erode a culture of strong and stable marriages. It was not the match that lit the fire. No-fault divorce was the match. But gay marriage was gasoline poured on the fire. It has accelerated a number of trends corrosive to marriage and corrosive to the common good. It has obviously had the effect of not just normalizing, but idealizing queer identities. By using the logic of liberalism to frame itself as a modern-day civil rights movement, the movement for marriage equality has made a moral virtue out of being queer. And now, 28% of Generation Z, the first generation to reach adulthood in a post-Obergefell world, identify as LGBTQIA, as opposed to 7% of my generation who reached adulthood before marriage was redefined anywhere in the United States. That's a 4-fold increase in the span from me to my children. Generation Z are also the most anxious and depressed generation ever, the most prone to self-harm and suicide. Could it be because their lives are not on a path toward the goods of marriage and parenthood, toward family? Today, 40% of people between the ages of 24 and 54 live alone in our country. That's insane to me. 40% of people between the ages of 24 and 54 live alone. What will that statistic be in 20 years when Gen Z shifts fully into that age range? All of this loneliness and disconnection from family life is a contributing factor to the so-called deaths of despair, to suicide, drug addiction, and porn addiction, to criminal activity and joblessness among young men, and all kinds of other downstream effects. And this shredding of the fabric of family and all of these downstream effects disproportionately impact poor and working class people who do not have the financial resources to purchase the goods and services that can simulate the support of a family, like childcare or counseling, or the ability to support 2 households after a divorce. Poor and working class people are bearing the burden of the death of the family to a much greater extent than affluent people are. Okay, so finally you might object. Okay, Jeremy, I see how marriage has this objective definition. I see that same-sex unions do not meet this objective definition, but some same-sex couples can and do raise children. Yes, that is true. But almost all of the circumstances in which same-sex couples come to raise children involve other injustices and harms to society. Same-sex couples either procure the use of reproductive technologies and practices like surrogacy, which violate the human rights of children and often of the surrogates as well, or they adopt children who could have otherwise been adopted by a married couple. And all children raised by same-sex couples, regardless of how they got there, are deprived of the experience of being raised by their mother and their father, or both, which is a grave violation of their human rights. Every person has a mother and a father, period, and has the right to be born to and raised by those parents. I'm going to say that again because it is counterintuitive to people, but it is true. Every person has a mother and a father and has the right to be born to and raised by those 2 parents. And it's become clear to me that one of the effects of calling same-sex unions marriages has been to normalize these reproductive technologies which violate that right. When I was teaching college students, and I would make the case that IVF and surrogacy were immoral, invariably the first response was, but what about gay couples? They should be able to have children too if they want children. And mainstream thought is now warming to the idea that same-sex couples have the same right to children as heterosexual couples, and therefore insurance companies or the government should cover the cost of whatever reproductive technologies they need to have children. To be clear, heterosexual couples do not have a right to children. No one has a right to children. Children are a gift from God which cannot be demanded as an entitlement. A right to children may sound compassionate on the surface, but the logic of it is quite chilling because it objectifies children. It also objectifies women and men. Because if couples who cannot bear children, like, say, for example, two gay men, have a right to children, that means that society has an obligation to provide them with an egg and a womb in order to produce the child they have a right to. And once we have detached parenting from the natural procreation of a man and a woman, what is the limiting principle that says only couples have a right to children? What about single people who want children? On what grounds can you say no to them? So now you are in a situation where any man who wants a child can demand of society that he be provided with eggs and surrogates. That sounds a heck of a lot more like The Handmaid's Tale than a federal ban on abortion does. My wife said no one would know what The Handmaid's Tale is. If you don't, it's a dystopic novel about women being forced to bear children that, what? And a TV show on Hulu, yeah. Okay, the second issue I want to address is transgenderism and gender ideology. The idea that our gender is something different than and not necessarily in concordance with our sex, and that some people therefore are trans. They are born with a gender identity that conflicts with the sex of their body. So what does the church have to say about this? How does it fit into the church's social teaching? This is an issue that has only come into mainstream civic discourse in the past 5 years or so. And so many people are under the impression that the church has no teaching on this, or that we don't have any definitive answers on this question yet. While it is true that we don't have a papal encyclical about transgenderism specifically, enough authoritative teaching has accumulated to give us clear guidance on this question. But before even turning to the teaching that directly addresses gender ideology, we would have enough to arrive at a conclusion about it just from the positive vision of marriage that the church gives and the things that she already prohibits to protect marriage. The beauty of marriage and the objective definition of marriage are rooted in its orientation toward procreation, which is founded on the biological and psychosocial complementarity of man and woman. So, we could pretty easily deduce from this that if the church cannot open marriage to two men, it cannot open marriage to a man and another man who identifies as a woman, since his identifying as a woman would not change the objective fact of his not being able to produce a child with another man. But we do have some magisterial teaching on this that addresses gender directly, and it's quite profound and beautiful. So let's take a look at it. In 2015, in Laudato Si, which is Pope Francis's encyclical about the environment, our economy, and the poor, he talks about how modernity gave rise to a mistaken understanding of man's dominion over the world. In Genesis 1 and 2, dominion means man recognizes his place in the cosmos and accepts the rest of creation as a gift to be stewarded within a natural order designed by God. But with the rise of modern science and technology, we became blind to the fact that nature, all the non-human things created by God, have their own integrity and value and cannot just be manipulated however we want. And dominion became instead domination. Then Pope Francis says, in order to relearn how to be stewards of the environment, we must remember that man too has a nature that he must respect and that he cannot manipulate at will. It is our body that establishes a direct relationship with the environment and with other living beings. I'm still quoting Francis here. The acceptance of our bodies as God's gift is vital for welcoming and accepting the entire world as a gift from the Father and as our common home. Whereas thinking that we would enjoy absolute power over our bodies turns often subtly into thinking we enjoy absolute power over creation. Still quoting Francis. Learning to accept our body, to care for it, and respect its fullest meaning is an essential element of any genuine human ecology. He then goes on, also, valuing one's own body in its femininity or masculinity is necessary if I am going to be able to recognize myself in an encounter with someone who is different. In this way, we can joyfully accept the specific gifts of another man or woman and find mutual enrichment. It is not a healthy attitude which would seek to cancel out sexual difference because it no longer knows how to confront it. All Francis. So, what Francis is saying there is that the destructive, technocratic mindset of domination that has created the environmental crisis is the same mindset that allows us to look at our own bodies and think that we can change our sex. So, if you want to be the kind of person who knows how to care for the earth, he's saying, you must start by accepting your sexed body as a gift. Likewise, if you care about diversity, about humans finding mutual enrichment across their differences, you must start by accepting your male or female body as a gift in its masculinity or its femininity, because sexual difference is the fundamental human difference. A year later, in Amoris Laetitia, which is about marriage, Francis picked up on this theme, saying, quote, ideologies of gender, which deny the difference and reciprocity in nature of a man and a woman, promote a personal identity and emotional intimacy radically separated from the difference between male and female. But sexual identity is not the choice of the individual. Biological sex and the socio-cultural role of sex, gender, can be distinguished but not separated. In other words, he's saying your biological sex can be conceptually separated from your gender, but your biological sex determines your gender identity. He goes on, it is one thing to be understanding of human weaknesses and the complexities of life, and another to accept ideologies that attempt to separate what are inseparable aspects of reality, sex and gender. Let us not fall into the sin of trying to replace the Creator. Creation is prior to us and must be received as a gift. We are called to protect our humanity, and this means, in the first place, accepting it and respecting it as it was created. This line of reasoning was first sketched out by Francis' predecessor, Pope Benedict, who wrote in his closing speech to the Curia, quote, the manipulation of nature, which we deplore today where our environment is concerned, now we claim as a fundamental choice where man himself is concerned. We reject or claim to alter man and woman in their created state as complementary versions of what it means to be human. But if there is no preordained duality of man and woman in creation, then neither is the family any longer a reality established by creation. And then the child has lost the place he had occupied and the dignity pertaining to him, and is no longer a subject with rights, but has become an object to which people have a right and which they have a right to obtain. In other words, just like the logic of same-sex marriage and technological reproduction, the logic of transgenderism leads us ultimately into the Handmaid's Tale, which is why Pope Francis has consistently denounced gender ideology, calling it earlier this year the ugliest danger of our time. A common objection to the stance against transgenderism is that it's such a minor phenomenon that there's no reason to get so worked up about it. A typical formulation of this objection appeared in a recent article trashing J.D. Vance, in which the author wrote, "It's weird to freak out that some people are trans." While it is true that this phenomenon affects a tiny portion of the population, there are two reasons that I think we should, in fact, be freaking out about it. The first is that part of this population is children. They really are transing the kids. It is not a right-wing conspiracy theory. Just a month ago, an organization called Do No Harm released a new database of all the instances they could find by researching insurance claims of sex change-related treatments given to children under the age of 17. So far, they have discovered 14,000 different children, including 6,000 of whom have had surgeries, who were treated between 2019 and 2023. But the organization says that this number represents only a fraction of the kids victimized by this, as they only had access to a limited number of insurance providers' data. And their number does not include families who didn't use insurance or hospitals who intentionally miscoded procedures to hide them. And they did not count 17-year-olds. There's no way that children who cannot even consent to getting a tattoo should be allowed to consent to procedures or drugs that will sterilize or permanently disfigure their bodies. This is child abuse. And it disproportionately impacts girls who are more prone to body dysmorphia. And while it's not possible to quantify the damage done to children by this, I would say that the trans movement and gender ideology have caused an even graver harm to the common good. And that is that they have manipulated our compassion in order to undermine our fundamental trust in the meaning of the shared reality that we all occupy. Male and female, mother, father, and child. These are categories that are so fundamental to reality that to give up on shared understandings of these categories is to give up on the idea that reality has any given meaning at all. It is to fully embrace subjectivism or relativism or nihilism. If we don't believe that the reality that exists out there prior to us, prior to our wills and our desires, has any given meaning, on what basis can we conduct rational civic discourse? On what basis can we have any kind of civic discourse that is anything other than a power struggle? It leaves us bereft of a shared reality. And that is the real reason that thoughtful people are freaking out about transgenderism and gender ideology. This brings me to the last point I want to make, which is about our tone or our posture as we engage with people who disagree with us about these issues. This is something that I have really changed my mind about over the last 10 years. Of course, when we engage with individuals in our lives who deal with same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria, we need to be compassionate and patient and kind. Of course. But we have somehow confused the kindness that we owe to individuals with the idea that we should soft pedal or sugarcoat or even just be silent about these issues in our public conversations. If the almost 10 years since Obergefell have shown us anything, it is that we will not catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. That the honey has just greased the slippery slope, and we have slid from being a society that won't speak up for the rights of unborn children to one that will not speak up for the rights of any children. We need to stop letting the culture gaslight us into being ashamed of marriage. Marriage is good news. The fact that God created us male and female and the sexed body is a beautiful gift, is good news. We need to be bold, not for our own religious freedom, but for the sake of the lost and hurting world. And even in our interpersonal relationships with people, we need to stop being polite. Kindness and politeness are not always the same, and it is not kind to be silent about the truth. Thank you.